Cool. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming to my session. We're going to talk about the new user interface API. My name is Craig Isaacson. I'm a technical architect at Sundog Interactive. I've been at Sundog Interactive for about 7 years now, working on Salesforce platform. It's been really great. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. It's super quick to develop with, and it's a lot of fun. At Sundog Interactive, we're a marketing technology company, specialized in the manufacturing vertical. We do a lot of work with custom communities, service cloud implementations, a sales cloud, different types of marketing, as well as Sitecore. So, real quick, I'm sure you've seen this a few times, this forward-looking statement, so make sure anything I say about the future, which I'm not planning to, don't use that to influence your buying decisions. So for this presentation, we have some code. We're going to have a demo. We also have the slides at the same link, so if you go to this link, you can download the slides there. Real quick, too, we do have a lot to cover. The user interface API has a lot to go over, and if you could please hold all of your questions at the end, that'd be great. And I also posted the same link into the session chatter, so if you log into the Dreamforce app, you can go ahead and see that there, too, as well. So we're going to be talking about the user interface API. We're going to talk about what it is, when to use it. We're going to talk about maybe reasons why we shouldn't be using it. And then we're going to hop into the demo and try and go over the API itself. So when I think about the user interface API, I think about a single API that returns both metadata for the UI as well as record data. So show of hands real quick, anybody out there who's created a custom UI solution with Salesforce before the UI API? Got one, couple, two. So if you've done that before, I'm sure you all know that working with the metadata, trying to grab the metadata, knowing when to show what values for the user depending on localization, currency, things like that, field level security. Doing that along with merging all of that with the record data that you get back from the REST API can be a little bit tricky. So Salesforce came to the rescue and gave us this new user interface API. So we can use this user interface API to build out different UIs on different platforms, whether it be Angular, Flutter, Polymer, React, or you can even use it for native iOS or Android applications. So the user interface API responds to metadata changes, such as layouts, pick lists, field level security, sharing, and other declarative functions. And on top of the user interface API, Salesforce developed the Lightning Data Service. So Lightning Data Service sits on top of the user interface API, and it provides us a JavaScript API for caching for record CRUD in your Lightning component without requiring any Apex. Now this slide here is the Lightning technology stack. As you can see here, we have the core platform and shared services down the bottom. From there, the user interface API is built on top of that. So Salesforce actually built this API before it was available to the public, just for them to use within their Lightning experience. So all the Lightning experience is built off this user interface API, and they did a great thing by basically making that API available to us as developers as well. And then on top of the user interface API, another level of abstraction higher, we have that Lightning Data Service I was talking about, and that just uses the same user interface API to give you the data and information that you want to use on your Lightning components. So when we're talking about the user interface API, there's a bunch of different benefits to using this. First, we have smart payloads. So you have both your metadata and data get returned to you with a single API call. So it makes it super handy for getting the data you need to both lay out the UI as well as populate the data for that UI. And it's smart payload, so it uses things like e-tags, so you can do caching of both the layout and data. And I can get into that more once we actually go through the JSON for the payload. We also get formatted and localized display values. So the user interface API always runs as the context of a specific user. So you're going to get those localized and formatted values right out of the box. There's no work for you to do. It just comes right through the API. All you have to do is display that on the page. And it works great for that, as well as field level security and sharing rules. All of that, along with business logic, is all built into the user interface API. So you don't have to do any complicated server logic. You make that call to the API, and it's all there for you. We also have different layout types and form factors. So if you think about it, you might be using this the UI API for maybe a mobile device, which might have a different layout type than, say, a tablet or desktop. And that's all supported, as well as different access modes. So viewing data as a view or maybe an edit is going to be different than if you're looking at, say, a clone and things like that. So there's a few different reasons why you might not want to use the user interface API. So the biggest thing is the name of the API is called the user interface API. So I would probably suggest keeping it to user interfaces. That's not to say you could potentially use it for system integrations, but it's not a good idea. It's going to be more overhead, and you should really leave that to APIs like the bulk API that are actually meant to do things like that. Like I said, Lightning components, we have the Lightning data service. You can use the force record data and other base components instead, so you don't really need to use the API in Lightning. And you want to make sure that apps that don't get updated, you're not using the API for those. Salesforce had indicated that the API itself, each version is going to be supported for 10 different versions. So you're going to want to make sure that if you are using the user interface API, the app does get updated within every 3 years at least. So the user interface API has all kinds of different endpoints that you can use. Probably the biggest one is for records, layouts, and object metadata. So that's the main one I always use. So you get all the metadata for the layouts as well as the record data. Like I said, you get those different types. So create, edit, and view modes. You can switch between those. We have different. It supports the clone and default values. That's all out of the box. So everything that you configure on Salesforce itself can come through the API for that. And another big one is pick lists with dependent pick lists. Before that used to be kind of a hassle trying to find out what that should look like. But with user interface API, those all come through as a dependency tree, and you can actually use those in your UI out of the box. It's pretty easy. Oh. And then we have child relationships. So junction lists, you can actually get all of that data too with a single call. You can specify that in the UI API to get the different child relationships as well as the data for those. And it also supports binary uploads, so you can do multi-part uploads of files within the UI API. You can also do patch requests as well, so you can actually do updates of records without passing in the whole record. You can just pass in certain fields that need to get updated, and that works out of the box as well. Other endpoints that are supported are actions. So you can do the list of actions with metadata. For that, we usually think about the custom buttons. We have navigations with favorites, so you can manage your favorites. You can add and edit those. It also supports searching for dependent lookups. So if you have dependent lookups on, say, an edit screen, you can use the search function to utilize that to find the records that you actually need. So now we're going to hop into a live demo. So first, it's a little bigger for you. So here we have the workbench. We just made a call out to the UI API. This is just the standard record UI endpoint. We're just passing in an account ID with a form factor of small. And this is what you get back from the UI API. So you get the E tag. So the E tag we can use in subsequent calls. We can add this E tag as the header. And when we actually make that call out, we'll get a 304 back if the data hasn't changed, whether it be for the UI or the record itself. So we can use cache data that we have on the device itself. And if we can open up the layouts, we can just go ahead and take a look at the account. You can see that we're going to the view mode. We have different sections. So if you're familiar with the page layouts at all, we have the account information section. We have the address information section of the accounts. And then within there, we have our layout rows. Layout rows are just the labels and the fields associated with those. So layout rows have the layout items. So we have our account owners. And as you can see, all the data that we get back for this is all data that we can use to build out our UI. So we have editable for new, editable for update. Also label values that are going to be contextual to the user that's using it. We have the different layout components, since a label could potentially have multiple fields. We also get the field names. We get if it's required or if it's sortable. So all that information comes back straight with the view, so you can build out your UI to match any of the information there. So then you also get the records. So this is actually the record for that account. And as you can see, the values come back in the UI, or from the UI API in that JSON payload. So you can reference all of the fields that come back in here in the records. There's no need to query those. Those all come back. It's all the fields that you need to display those on the UI. So for the demo, what I did was I created a hybrid mobile application using Force Hybrid. If you're familiar with that, it's basically an NPM package that you can run that will automatically create a mobile application that uses the Salesforce SDK. It has built-in authentication and everything else like that. So I use this to create a hybrid mobile application, and I can pull that up for you right now. And we'll just do a quick demo. This list of accounts is basically out of the box with that Force Hybrid mobile app, or mobile Force Hybrid NPM package. Builds this logic for you right out of the box. What I added was essentially you click on an account, and we pull up all of the account information. So as you can see, this is our mobile layout, and we can pull it up on our tablet, and we have our tablet layout. As you can see, if you've ever done this before, you can see that it's actually moving the fields where they should for the mobile layout. So we have our rating down here below everything else, whereas if we were using that same layout, the rating would be mixed in between with this second column. And I have intentionally kept all of this very bare bones, because I know that when I like to see demo code, I want to see it just working so I can update it myself. So now we can hop into the code for how that works. So like I said, it's just the bare bones Salesforce Force Hybrid local application. We have our www folder, which is the root for that mobile app. And with this mobile app for that template for the UI, I used Handlebars as the templating library for that. So Handlebars is a JS templating library. And like I had said previously, when we're showing the accounts, this show account list gets called. And all that's doing is just making a call against Salesforce for those accounts, and then spits those out on the page itself. So that's all built into that Force Hybrid mobile app. What we added right here was this show account function. So this is going to actually get that data from the UI API. So we grab the record ID from that account that you clicked on, and we basically build out the parameters for the UI API to call out to get that information. And this little bit right here, we're just doing a real quick check to see if we're on a phone or tablet, because we want to use a medium form factor if we're using a tablet, and small if we're using the phone. And then we call this function here Force UI API. So this is a new function that I added to the Force.js. So if you've used ForceTK before, this is essentially the same thing. It's basically just the library that contains a whole bunch of helper functions for calling different pieces of the REST API in Salesforce. So I basically did the same pattern that they used for all the other ones, brought it down here, changed the endpoint so we're using the UI API, and then we basically build out the params, set the form factor, and make the request. So when we make the request, we have our successful handler, which is this handle accounts. So we're going to go into here. We take the data that we get back from the UI API, we put it to a local variable that we can reference later on, so we can either cache that data, or we use it to actually show the data from the template. And then this bunch here, this is all essentially just creating that new, or compiling that handlebars template, and then setting the accounts information into that template, and setting the container on that form to that template. So I'm going to pull up the template just to show you how quick and easy it is to do it. So while this was for account, you can imagine that this could be used for a whole bunch of different other objects. The layout of the UI API is going to be very similar. So this layout would essentially work with pretty much any other object or custom object. So here we're just iterating through each of the accounts. We only have the one, and then we're going to go ahead and iterate through the sections. We're going to spit out the heading, and then we're going to iterate through each of those layout rows and layout items. And once we do that, we essentially have a handlebars helper that sets the columns. So if it's the mobile, or the columns actually come back in the UI, so we can set those columns here, and it'll actually show up in the UI when we build it out. And then we just show the label for that item, and we loop through the layout components. So each item might have multiple field values that need to go in there. And for that, we're just calling this other helper function called value. So this is just a handlebars helper. And we're just doing a couple little updates, manipulating the JSON so we can get the right record. And then we're just grabbing the right record from that record in the JSON payload. So, real quick, I'm going to show that it is actually pulling through. So if we go to our account, let's see, we have this field dynamic query. It doesn't appear to have anything on it. So we'll go ahead and remove that. We have that there on the tablet as well as here on the phone. We'll just open up the account layout and scroll down to our dynamic query. Remove that, save it. Then we'll go back to our account list. We'll refresh it. And as you can see, that dynamic query has been removed. We'll do that here too as well. And that is gone as well. So to wrap up, the UI API has a lot of cool different things you can do. We've just really scratched the surface on how to do this. It's a really great tool for actually building different UIs on different platforms. It gives you all the tools that you need to basically build those out. And there is a great trailhead, so I would suggest if you want to learn more about it, check out the trailhead. There's a lot of great information about the UI API there, as well as check out the docs. The docs have great information on each of the endpoints, sample data that comes back from them, how to call them, and all the things that have to do with that UI API. And for that, that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions, I can go ahead and take those from you. Sure?
Does it have any object limitations? Like Lightning Data Service doesn't work for few objects, like a task and events?
Yep, so the question was, are there any object limitations for the UI API? So there are some standard objects that aren't included with it. All custom objects do work. I would suggest if you go to the documentation, they have a list of actually all the objects that are supported. So that'd be a great place to check out. Yep.
In the layout editor, how are you deciding which of the form factors your changes are going to affect?
So that was just using the default mobile form factor. So that just uses the main one. If you had a specific one for like a mobile card, then you would have to update that one. But I didn't have that set up on there.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Yep.
Does it pull in related list data?
Yes. Yep. You can pull in related lists. There's also list views too, so you can pull in all the data there. I should have showed it, but in that UI API call that you make, there is a child relationships. You can pull if you specify that in the call out itself in the endpoint, you can pull in that data for those child relationships as well. All right. Thanks, guys. And if you don't know already, you should check out the developer keynote. Thank you, guys.